Okay, here's one that's been given to me by one of my regulars and thought it might be a good follow up or add on to the other one that I recently did about Australians. And I think he's probably correct. It's done by what I understand is a local Australian. He's also a poet and an author and apparently a researcher. And it's entitled Who Were the First Australians? It's a three-parter, and I don't know how many parts we'll break it into here in 45-minute increments, but each successive part will be in your top left-hand corner. So let's just get into this. This researcher's name is Alan James. Until a few decades ago, Australian universities often trained archaeology students to go on digs in the Middle East and elsewhere, but seldom equipped them for field work in their own country. The prevailing belief seems to have been that archaeological research in Australia was largely a waste of time, been there, done that, or they knew what was going on and had been going on, and the continent, it was felt, hadn't been occupied for very long, or not by civilization, as you would say. It would be something that was much more pre-Neolithic. Anyway, the early occupants hadn't done very much of note. For example, it wasn't until the middle of May 1994 that the general public learned of the existence of an enormous Koori burial ground at Lake Victoria. This graveyard in the extreme southwest of New South Wales is so extensive that its discovery may lead to a massively increased estimate of the Koori population of Australia at the time of European settlement, which was believed to have been much smaller. It adds nothing, however, to our knowledge of when the first human inhabitants arrived in Australian continent and how they came here, who they were. So really it's a more recent burial ground done by these Koori people and doesn't actually have connections back into the 40 to 60 to perhaps 85,000 years that people have apparently been on Australia as a continent. Unless some crucial information relating to the Lake Victoria site has not been released, it cannot do so for reasons that will become obvious. Yet these questions are important and should be addressed. So when did humans first occupy Australia? Well, the answer keeps changing as the new discoveries are made. Until 1960, the earliest human fossil found in Australia was the 9,000-year-old Taglay skull from southeast Queensland. You see, some of this archaeology had to be done in a theoretical type way, where we realized that by the time of the last ice age and knowing the depth of the oceans and how it was much more shallow, leading to coastlines and so on, that certain continents were connected, and then it flooded up over and they were no longer connected and became islands that are much smaller. Australia was hooked to Irian Jaya and so on. But that was still disconnected from the mainland. So it really would be its own continent, of course it is. But it was still disconnected, and there's that Wallace line they talk about, and really if you want to talk about an ancient continent of Mu, this would have been containing that, and later a area known as Siam and so on like that. But that's different things, different vids, concepts, timelines, everything. But knowing that these people had somehow got there is one way we can show that somehow there was some boating going on at least 40,000 years ago, because that was the professed amount of time by the time I was going into school and doing so. And they found another found that goes to 50, and then somebody professed something that went to 85. Let's just continue. In 1962, John Mulvaney found human artifacts in Queensland's Kenneth Cave that were dated to 16,000 years ago, and by 1972 the period of occupation had been doubled when a 32,000-year-old skeleton was found in the sands of Lake Mungo in South Wales that I talked about in my other video. For a concise review of the current orthodoxy, it is hard to go past New N.G. Butlin's elegant summary. In 1989, Professor Butlin wrote that given their reliance on identifiable evidence, prehistorians have generally, but not always, been cautious in their statements about Aboriginal migrations. Bam. The few comments here do not do justice to differences of opinion between some individuals, but very briefly indicate what appears to be a prevailing view. It is agreed that Aborigines arrived by sea. Their ancestors passed out of Southeast Asia through the islands, and the ultimate immigrants arrived not less than 40,000 years ago. And again, this was via Irian Jaya. And to this day, you can see that there is a somewhat connection to the people of Irian Jaya, yet you can definitely tell there is something quite different. In both of their phenotypes, there is a small gene pool of different phenotypical faces and stuff to use in that, and even a lack of sexual dimorphism between the male and female and so on that you can see in these populations, much less than in a bunch of others. And there's been a lot of studies that have talked about these type of things, but these were all in the days whenever they had National Geographic and things like that whenever I was growing up. In a modern day, that's really changed. In fact, Nat Geo's come out themselves and said they will no longer talk about any primitive people in the world because that's just feelings. Now, since New Guinea was joined physically to Australia about 100,000 years before, about 8,000 years before present, whenever the Younger Dryas, and then we flooded up, the most common belief now seems to be a first arrival in New Guinea and then land passage to the present Australian mainland. And that's how they got there. But the dates keep being revised upwards. In 1989, a team of anthropologists from the Australian National University announced the discovery of a fragment of human bone near Lake Eyre that was dated by its fluorine content to about 60,000 years before present. That's quite dramatic change. Yet, by this time, there was already indirect evidence suggesting that humans were in Australia much earlier than that. In 1986, Edmund Gill and Dr. John Sherwood announced that a hoard of apparently cooked shellfish remains found at the Hopkins River near Warrnambool was between 60,000 and 80,000 years old. And this was worked shellfish and then apparently cooked too. So this indicates that there's some type of hominid, somebody's going on doing this to that level. The late Dr. Gurdip Singh analyzed pollen from the Lake George near Canberra and concluded that the dramatic change of vegetation at about 130,000 years ago suggested that humans had caused this damage by repeatedly setting fire to the bush. I saw a video presentation, and it's been so long ago, I believe I saw it on VHS, that was talking about this and so on, because they were talking about some wildfires that had gotten going. And in fact, recently they had that happen again, didn't they? Then in 1992, Dr. Peter Kershaw, an ecologist at Monash University, studied a core of sediment taken from what is now a seabed near the Great Barrier Reef. The area which used to be above sea level. It had been dominated by conifers such as hoop pines and bunya pines, so conifer trees, about 150,000 years ago. The conifers died out and were replaced by fire-tolerant eucalypts. And that was something that was shown in this, It was like it ended up making a haven for the creatures, koalas, that eat eucalyptus and so on, because they are so tolerant to a quick burn as opposed to a prolonged burn, which a lot of others weren't, and their seeds and the way things reacted, to where it allowed them to be much more substantial. And then with periodic burns coming around, it ended up stripping the land of some of the essential plants that go along with pines that make that forest work, and then it collapsed. And it left us behind the mesquite-ish type scrub work that we see in Australia today. And there's still some primordial trees in there. You know, Australia is separated so much, and kind of like a land that time forgot, to where there are the marsupial populations, snakes that are there that are extremely venomous, certain things. And of course, growing up, you hear great white sharks and everything, and it's just like dun on that place. But yet, of course, sharks can swim anywhere in the ocean, and they're all over the place. Back to this, though. So this was accompanied by a steep rise in charcoal sediments. This supposed burn that happened around 1,000 years ago, and the core sediment at 150 showed conifers, as well as eucalypts. After pondering every natural explanation for the change, Dr. Kershaw considers it most likely represents the appearance of fire management by the contingent's early human migrants. It couldn't be something that just took off of an occasional fire that maybe lightning and so on does, but it doesn't make any sense off that. And if you think about the weather patterns that go over there, it doesn't allow that to happen very easily, although it can still happen in a modern day. What is clear from all this is that humans have been present in Australia for a very long time. 150,000 years ago is the earliest date seriously proposed at this stage for their arrival. Further discoveries might as well push back that date further back into the past. To be continued in part 2. So now we're going to go on down to part 2 here. This is Alan James. He's a proudly Anglo-Celtic poet and the author of New Britannia, The Rise and Decline of Anglo-Australia. I believe he's an Australian, and other than being an author, apparently he's a researcher on this. It's part 2 and 3 here. Let's make sure we click on part 2. And so, continued. Of these 150,000 years that we were speaking of, we know that modern Europeans have been present in Australia since 1788, which is really 1% or less than 1% of that time. Of course, it began as a penal colony and so, but see, you'd have to realize that before that happened, they knew that it existed, or they wouldn't put people there. Anyhow, the people that I'm calling Kooris, a term that many Australian Aborigines use to describe themselves, especially in New South Wales, have been present a lot longer. To the best of our current knowledge, people who looked like modern Kooris may have existed in Australia for perhaps up to 10% of the entire period of human occupation. In other words, that's not the way that they looked. This is a reference point to my earlier video on Australia, talking about that there were some hominid types who had lived on around the earth until a much more modern time, i.e. it wasn't too long ago when we were thinking, well, Homo erectus died off hundreds of thousands of years ago. giving rise to da-da-da and Homo sapiens, then that, and then Cro-Magnon and so on. No, it didn't work that way. In fact, Cro-Magnon still exists. They've renamed it early European modern humans because at least 30,000 years ago, the exact same genetics, phenotype, and everything exists, but really 315,000 years ago at Jebel Erud Cave in Morocco is showing a Caucasoid phenotype headed that way. Sure, we've had a little upgrade in between then and now, but that small upgrade was a better chin and a little bit bigger brain capacity due to the fact that that Cro-Magnon that we're looking at in a lot of its cases was well over 6 foot, had a bigger crane capacity even than we have today, and anybody that it impinged upon that had a small cranial capacity got upgraded, but of course didn't catch up fully. We can see that evidence in quite a few people around the planet. But let's just continue. No human remains that resemble modern Kuris have yet been discovered from earlier than about 13,000 years before the present, or 11,000 BC. Really 10,500 if we did, and then all of a sudden, hey, there's that same time period where it seems like so much happened that we never knew that we never knew. It coincides with the Younger Dryas period, and then shortly after there, that land bridge went away to Australia. Yeah. And the one in America changed too, but there was supposed to have been that little gap there. But of course we found people in America that predate that gap and its projected dating to its longest points, which reveals a whole lot of other, but that's not what this is about. We're on the other side of the world. All Australian human remains of an earlier date look as different from Kuris as modern Zulus look different from Kalahari Bushmen. Prior to the Holocene period, there is ample evidence of two completely separate forms of humanity in Australia. Whenever I made my recent video, I talked about there's a couple of other finds that are showing this too that are odd. We're going to talk about one of them here. One type is best represented by the people discovered at Lake Mungo. The other is typified by the people found at Cow Swamp. The female skull, known as Mungo 1, is discovered in 1969 after lying undisturbed since she was ritually cremated, possibly 26,000 years ago. The intact male skeleton of Mungo 3 was found in 1974 and had been buried maybe some 30,000 years ago, and these Ice Age people from Lake Mungo were very fine-featured and slenderly built. They recreations don't look like a modern Australian Aborigine, let's just say. They had none of the characteristics that modern scientists call archaic to them at that point, such as extremely thick brows, bone, or a steeply sloping forehead. As might be expected from their modern appearance, the Mungo people enjoyed what was, for the times, a sophisticated way of life. They caught golden perch and fixed gill nets, and foraged for mussels, yabbies, emu eggs, and various small birds and animals. They even ground wild grass seed to make and form bread. The people at Cow Swamp near Kahuna were found in a graveyard containing at least 40 graves. Burials at this site continued from about 15,000 to 9,000 years ago, and then it fades. Although only half as ancient as the Lake Mungo people, the Cow Swamp people were far more archaic physically. They looked more like a Homo erectus type. They had large, long heads with exceptionally thick bone, up to 1.3 centimeters thick. Their faces were large, wide, and projecting, like prognathism, with prominent brow ridges and flat, receding foreheads, and the jaws and teeth are massive Neither of these resemble contemporary Koori people, though. Neither of them. Josephine Flood commented that all the Australian Pleistocene human remains lie outside the range of present-day Aboriginal skeleton forms of the appropriate sex, but they fall into two contrasting groups, one more lightly built than any modern Australian Aborigines, the other was more rugged and archaic looking. The gracile peoples such as Mungo 1 and 2 are generally thought to have originated from near Palawan in the Philippines. So these island people are cruising back and forth in the islands back in the Wayback Machine. But somebody who would look at that phenotype looks not like Australian Aborigines of today, but more like the people of the Philippines. There's a few of those connectives, so this is why they instantly said, well, they all came over here. The problem is, when you mix that together or give combinations of it, it doesn't end up being a soup that ends up being modern Australian Aborigines. The more recent, more primitive people we're talking about here included those from Cow Swamp, Cossack, which is strangely a Russian word, but and Talgai are often considered to be descendants of Solo Man. He's from central Java, a Java-type man, a pre-Proto-Islander, if you will. And so a lot of people have found that, and they said, well, that, and it kind of looks a little more like these people. A problem ensues on when you're going to try to interject and not interject a slanting eye or a eye slit that has that crossover effect that Orientals have, but that's not for this video, really. Some of these people were so archaic, such as the male form from Alandra Lakes, known as WLH50, that they even made their presumed relatives at Cow Swamp look comparatively modern. So in other words, these Cow Swamp people, in comparison to the Willandra Lakes people, look a lot more modern too. So we have something that's a defined hominid, whereas you might think of the others as some type of crisscross of others and Filipinos types. So it's much more complex than people give credit for. There's not a 1, 2, 3 and a simple math equation to it all. There ends up being percentages and hybrids and situations, but many academics today argue that Australia's Kooris are partially descended from some of these earlier types of humanity. To give one example, Dr. Rhys Jones of ANU has been quoted as inferring that since most Kooris have skulls halfway between Solo Man and modern man, they are probably a mixture of Solo Man and later waves of immigrants are perhaps being impinged upon. This same type of flip that happens at this 10,000 year barrier situation or shortly after in quite a few places around the world is also indicative in sub-Saharan Africa, where they had a similar situation going on, though they're not related. They have a similar situation going on where all we're finding is hominids, and even in fact until that real close to a modern date, and then it flips at a certain point, and it was because of later waves of already modern immigrants. Later loose comments or reporting of this kind are the basis on which Kooris lay claims to a longer heritage in Australia than they can demonstrate. In other words, they can't show that that's them past a certain dating, which is only in the 7, 8, 9,000 year range and fades. And they can't connect themselves, but because of heritage, and then of course this colonization attempt, You know, whenever I was a kid and you first started hearing about this situation was whenever you first had that World is Burning song out by Australia. Yeah, there was a lot of Men at Work and all kinds of cool songs coming out of there. But there's the other one too that was real cool and hip, came out, banging drums, and 45 degrees. And of course, we had learned that they're under the metric system, and 45 degrees isn't real damn cold there. It's actually well over 100 degrees. During those summers, though, it was summers of Texas whenever I was growing up the end of high school age, and every day in the summer was over 100 degrees. I remember it not breaking down under 90 degrees through the night times. The tar on the street starting to bubble up, getting on people's cars, on their shoes, on their flip-flops and so on, and caking up and doing things. It was really quite the thing. I believe the record that we had in 84 was like 113, but if I remember back in like 80, 81, the summer of that, it was 116. We also had some 2.5 months straight of over 108 degrees, and a lot of people died of heat stroke. It was really an issue, but I digress. The events of August 1990, however, show that genuine respect for Kuris as a people should not be allowed to interfere with rigorous scientific procedure. So regardless of this wanting to pander, reality would have to be looked into account. Or you could just set up a false thing, and that wouldn't be really rational or correct, would it? In 1990, the Echuca, I hope I'm saying that right, Aboriginal cooperative laid claim to the cow swamp remains. They informed the Museum of Victoria that they regarded these ancient bones as relics of their own ancestors and that they wanted to rebury them in a secret location. Dr. Alan Thorne, the original excavator at Cow Swamp, and Professor John Mulvaney, an eminent prehistorian, both protested. The Cow Swamp people, they argued, were not directly ancestral to anyone living in the area today, that there's no derivative point that we could get you to where those were the actual pre-people to the people that we see today. They display anatomical features not present in living people generally, or Aboriginal people in particular. Dr. Thorne was reported to having said, L.R. Hyatt, past president of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, wrote that the nature of the evolutionary links between the fossils of Cow Swamp and modern Aborigines is a matter of considerable scientific controversy. In view of some exceptional archaic features of the former, any claim by the people of Echuca for a direct ancestral connection would have to be regarded as highly problematic and involve some unknown people that they would have been mixed with to come out with the point that they are today. Apparently, right? Many other scientists, social commentators, and reporters criticized the proposal, though. Even the staff association at the Museum of Victoria objected. Perhaps the most telling comment came from Peter H. Bigot, PM or AM, former chairman of the Federal Government Committee of Inquiry on Museums and National Collections. In a letter to the Australian published on 9th of August 1990, he fulminated that many archaeologists believe that the Cow Swamp people represent a different and earlier migration of people to Australia than the ancestors of the present-day Aborigine. Of this course may, in the minds of the few radicals pressing for the destruction of Cow Swamp remains, be a sinister thorn in the side of the land rights claim. In their minds, such as an earlier migration puts the latter in the same category as the one 200 years ago. The only difference being that they, this later people 200 years ago, were actually white people. In other words, they have a connection about like that. The cow swamp material is of an extra national importance and cannot be claimed by people living today. Separated by 750 different generations and a different race. Even though many eminent scientists had by now admitted that the cow swamp remains were of a different race to the Koris, the remains were handed over to the Echuca Aboriginal Cooperative by Dr. McHutchinson, the Victorian Minister for the Arts, and Mr. Meyer, who is the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. They were subsequently reburied, perhaps just in time to prevent scientific testing that might have shown conclusively that contemporary Koris are genetically unrelated or related to the cow swamp people, or perhaps not just in time. In June 1991, Alan Thorne was reported as saying that a sample of DNA had somehow been obtained from one of these cow swamp skulls and was being genetically tested. What of the slender, modern-looking Lake Mungo people? Surely the Koris would find it even harder to claim relationship with those people, who were not only of a different race, but also separated from any living human by 1,500 generations. Well, not so. It seems that some compromise was reached between science and political expediency, and on the 11th of January 1992, Mungo woman's remains were handed over to the local Kuri community for safekeeping. Future scientists would only be able to examine these remains with the approval of a modern Kuri custodian. In July 2021, however, the federal government's Department of Agriculture, Water, and the Environment sought public comment on the Department of Premier and Cabinet's proposal to complete a series of reburial ceremonies, including the excavation of graves for the reburial of 108 Willandra Lakes Aboriginal ancestors at 26 different sites within the Willandra Lakes region, World Heritage Area in New South Wales, while the public was given a scanty 10 working days to make submissions. You can see that there at that link. Despite the wild claims so clearly summed up by Peter Pigot as being related to the land rights issues, there is not a shred of hard evidence that modern Koris are related in any way to the two races that have so far been discovered to have preceded them in Australia. So in other words, to sum it up, these people don't have a phenotype that can be derived from either one of these sites of people that they're trying to claim. And it would surely involve a third that's not shown. And then to get to their modern point, there would have been a fourth at around that 8 to 10,000 BC range, leaving the modern form that we see today. And they can't find that hookup. It's the hiccup that was in that video about Australians, how all of a sudden, boop, and then they changed. Well, same thing happened in sub-Saharans, and they changed. You'll find that in the Orient, something happened, and some people changed over there too. That's a totally different issue. So now let's go on to part 3 and see if we can get this thing in, because it's really going to suck if it goes to a part 2 and I can't get the end of this in. See if I can get this to lock on. The Pale People. Perhaps other types of early humans also walked Australian soil long before the Koris, or even earlier Cow Swamp and Lake Mungo people. Even earlier. It is possible a few decades ago we only had a fraction of our current knowledge of Australians' prehistory. That's not one sentence, because a few decades ago we did only have a few pieces and a fraction of the current knowledge that we have today of Australia's prehistory, and we're finding that case along with the rest of the world pretty much. Kind of a refinding, if you will. There's no reason to believe that exciting finds will not continue to be made. Ironically, evidence from the Kuris themselves suggests that a spectacular discovery may soon change our whole understanding of early Australia in the most radical way. Kuri legends refer to various types of previous inhabitants. Yep, they're folklore. These include the creators of the Mimi, or dynamic, or Bradshaw style of rock arts, which Kuris have always said was done by another people altogether, or sometimes by spirits. There's also a time before time situation that kind of, if you listen to it, disjuncts them from the situation totally, easily, and just say, well, we don't remember, so there's this dream time. But they also talk about these craters here, and again, like in many places around the world, the Caucasians that are there keep trying to shove down their throats that they made this rock art, this is you, and they're going, no, we got this big old thing that we stayed away from this because it's bad juju and everything, because we had nothing to do with it. It was another people. What? The legends also refer to a light-skinned early race. For instance, one collection of orally transmitted legends says there's a story concerning the killing of a huge cannibal, like a giant. The narrator says if he had stayed alive, he would have gone on killing people, us dark people, and those pale people. He would have killed us all. Kind of starts sounding like a Lovelock Cave situation where there was a giant type people and redheads. The odd thing about these giant stories, if you look into them, even in the Caucasian stories about giants, they're always Caucasoid type giants, aren't they? We would say generally. Those pale people are not Makassans, which is Indonesians who are known to have been fishing off northern Australia in pre-European times. That's because in the story 194 from the same source, the Moccasins are openly called just that. So there's a different people involved. Nor are those pale people ghosts. The local word for ghost is Mogwai. So who are those pale people? Well, I'll give you again, who was a Mogwai? Where's that word come from? When you think about little creatures that are supposed to not be fed after midnight, don't get in the water, certain situations, and this Mogwai thing that we've talked about, that's a different thing totally, isn't it? But that's kind of where that word comes from, and of course it's supposed to have been some oriental creature that don't let it loose, and somehow it got let loose. But that's okay, they got it back in the box. There was a couple of good movies out of that. Kinda. In traditional times, it used to be a custom in most of northern Australia that a newborn child is rubbed with ashes to ensure that it will become dark in coloring like its parents. That's the reason they said that it would be done so. You can find rituals where they do this to babies a lot, but you know, one thing weird about it is ashes are black a lot, but then there's a lot of white in ash too. When you break it down, it ends up being carbon. If you wet it though, it turns darker. The light doesn't show up as well, mixes in, gets muddied away. It takes something like charcoal to end up having it have no whiteness to it. When you look at regular ash, it will have that effect to it. But the thing that's kind of, I guess, mentally supposed to be pointed out here is that if there's no evidence, no this, that, and the other, then why would they have these stories about to be like this as opposed to something else? As if at one point that got favored back in another way. Why would this ash thing go on? Well, true albinism is unknown among Kuris. The strange custom could suggest the fear of the evidence of some light-skinned pre-1788 ancestry. Could be. Definitely some people being there that had lighter skin like that. Such an interpretation is bolstered by other suggestions of a possible light-skinned presence in pre-Kuri Australia. Are there any archaic whites? Well, there are physical anomalies in modern Kuris that are difficult to dismiss as mere local adaptations. One is the occasional occurrence of blonde hair, which probably is more in the Melanesian islands. Blondness is usually taken to be an adaptation to the climatic conditions of northern Europe, not those of the Australian desert. Another anomaly is that, again, like northern Europeans, Kuri hair is oval in cross-section. It's actually not like black people, like people would like to think. So it's one of a lot of reasons, and then full genetics that shows that they're not actually related to the sub-Saharans in any way, although there is a convergence with some type of look, and that might involve the same ideal going on in both places. Well, it seems like in sub-Saharan Africa it's because of a long existing hominid like Homo erectus or heidelbergensis that lived on along right up until this threshold time that we're talking about, and then was impinged on by somebody else. The thing is, in Australia, they have different skulls there. It's not the same situation going on. And then how did it end up here from what you have there? It's almost a non-equation thing. How did you make a pie out of that? How did you make a cake out of that? That ended up looking like this. This could confer no conceivable survival advantage to Kuris in Australia, really, if you think about it, suggesting that it may reflect some crossbreeding in the past, that's where it came from. As with northern Europeans, Kuri skulls are usually dilocephalic, which might be telling also. Their amount of body hair is well within the European ranges of body hair, so their average height is also again at 165, 100 centimeters, 70 centimeters in an average. In fact, that true throwbacks don't occur in modern European Kuri crosses suggest that we are closer genetically than, say, Negroids are and whites in the United States. So there's closer connection up the tree of that. But then again, the farthest people, actually, when you look on a genetic tree, are the Melanesians from Negroids, which would seem odd if you looked at them and thought about it. Boyd in 1950 used this fact to assert that the genetic closeness of Kuris to Europeans, and he said Kuris were basically like whites, or basically white, which I don't have a necessarily total agreement with this concept. But in 1949, J.B. Birdsell proposed a tri-hybrid theory of Kuri origins, which might work. He suggested that three groups had contributed to the modern mixed Kuri race: an archaic whites allied to the Ainu of Japan, Negritos, not Negroids, similar to the relic populations in the Andaman Islands, and the Carpentarians, which are similar to relic populations in southern India, which have been changed, of course, from a similar situation. The archaic whites are the interesting part of this suggested mixture, though. The Ainu of northern Japan, although now much mixed with modern Japanese, are said to be among the last survivors of a once large population of archaic whites in Asia. We could probably say Caucasians, and it would make